and getting recharged for 2022. I'm Julia Zadar-Prochnik, and I am the Executive Director of the Long Duration Energy Storage Association of California, and happy to be facilitating today's meeting. And we'll be keeping an eye on the hands that are raised and the comments and questions in the chat. Our agenda for today, and I am going to come to Kathleen and ask a quick clarifying question. So we're going to start with a presentation from PG&E. It seems like they have one of the longest, so it'll be about an hour, and we'll stop for some clarifying questions and have some Q&A at the end. And Kathleen, we were going to have lunch after the Q&A, but because in Vistra's presentation there are some hedging components, we wanted to ask you, would you like to move your presentation up before lunch and then kind of have all the hedging aspects together? Because then we have a presentation from CalWIA that also incorporates some other elements that they wanted to reintroduce.
Hey, yeah, Julia, I shot you guys an email, but I'll just share here. I will need a whole hour for my entire presentation. So my only concern with that is kind of starting and stopping and flow, kind of whatever we think works. If there's time, I'm happy to go, but I just did want to say I think I will need the whole hour.
Okay, thanks for clarifying that too. I think your email just came in right now. So
sorry about that.
No, it's fine. It's been the joys of my internet. So the I think, well, Nancy, are you on? Let me see if I see.
Yeah, I'm on, but Darius is doing the presentation. I'm not sure he's on.
Okay. Well, let's just let's keep it as it is, because I don't know, and then I think the whole day, we can come back to the Q&A at 1:30 unless Lisa or Luke or others want to change it. But I think we're okay with how it is. Okay, I see nodding some heads. All right. So thanks again for all your flexibility. Again, thank you for joining today. I also want to point out in the conversation on the right, if you see that little box with the kind of the chat symbol, Lisa has put in the friendly reminders. So again, the meeting's being recorded. Please mute yourself. And then the next and final workshop with UCAP and multi-year is on Wednesday, January 19th. If you're interested in presenting at the workshop, please contact the co-facilitators by this Friday. And if you need to know who they are, just ask in the chat and we can send the emails. And again, if you want to present, make sure that you notify the group by this Friday and then send your materials on the 14th. And then the next set of informal comments are due on Wednesday, the 26th. And this is for the hedging and then the UCAP and multi-year workshops. If you need any additional information, go ahead and put it in the chat or ping us, and look forward to the conversation and dialogue today. So I will hand it over to PG&E. So thank you all.
All right, thanks, Julia. Let's go ahead and bring up the presentation here. Okay, hopefully everyone can see the screen.
Yes, you're good.
Yes, okay, great, thanks. Okay, so we'll go ahead and dive in here in a minute. As you probably noticed, PG&E tries to start any kind of meeting or workshop with a safety message. There's a lot of things on this slide. I'll just focus on one of these, psychological safety, which feels like it's kind of appropriate given that it's early January. There's probably a lot of people out there making resolutions, thinking about resolutions, that sort of thing. And I'll just share some of the strategies over the years that seem helpful in terms of actually keeping those resolutions. And so a couple of those are, if you're looking at things like, exercising more, eating healthier, which a lot of us probably are, kind of having more specific resolutions tend to be more successful. And so something like exercising more by itself probably won't, get you through, maybe January and further. But looking at more specific things like when exactly you're going to exercise, booking that in your calendar, thinking through all of the things that you have to do, to kind of like get ready to exercise, for instance? Do you have the clothing and shoes and exercise program, et cetera, that you need? Yeah, so I'll stop there in terms of safety, and then we'll go ahead and jump in. Okay, so just with background, so Track 3B2, the kind of the scoping memo and kind of various amended scoping memos outlined kind of the rationale for this track, and it was focused, it has been focused on a kind of examination of the broader RA capacity structure to address energy attributes and hourly capacity requirements, given a number of things. So increasing penetration of use-limited resources, greater reliance on preferred resources, rolling off of a significant amount of long-term tolling contracts held by utilities, and material increases in energy and capacity prices experienced in California over the past years. So we've underlined a couple of things here that we feel like are very much tied to the thinking behind hedging, and including, potentially including the hedging component into the final framework. We've also outlined, or underlined, excuse me, one of the principles, all right? And so we've included the 5 principles directed by the CPUC in the July decision. And the first one in particular seems, appropriate given the hedging discussion, right? So balancing reliability with minimizing costs to customers. And so the objective of hedging is really to ensure that costs to customers remain reasonable, and even under stress conditions. I'll just mention the other 4 principles here quickly. We like to start the workshops with a review of these. So balancing hourly energy sufficiency with advancing environmental goals, balancing granularity and meeting hourly needs with simplicity and transactability, implementable in the near term, right, in 2024 being the target for that, and then lastly, durable and adaptable to a changing electric grid. Okay, so the July decision that directed further development of the slice of day framework did have some discussion about hedging, and we've pulled a couple citations from that decision that I think kind of inform what the commission was thinking when they directed kind of these sets of workshops and the workshop report that's coming up in February. So the first one, particularly given the summer 2020 electricity outages and the reliance on import energy to serve California's load, we find it critical that a future framework include a component that links RA to a resource's energy bidding behavior so as to increase the cost effectiveness of RA. And then the second one, the commission remains concerned that PG&E's approach, as well as other proposals, lack a means to ensure that RA is linked with energy bidding behavior in order to balance reliability with minimizing costs to customers. Therefore, the commission directs parties in workshops to discuss and propose a hedging component as part of the final proposed framework, such as PG&E's hedging proposal, Energy Division's bid cap proposal, or aspects of the SFPFC. So this is the forward price fixed contract concept. And so we've outlined the 4 kind of proposals that we think are still kind of under consideration, although I think there's still room for other thoughts or new proposals. So PG&E's proposal, there was really kind of 2.
Sorry to interrupt. I keep hearing someone interrupt and like opening up cans of bottles or doing something. So I just want to make sure everyone mutes their phone so we can hear you clearly. Thanks so much. Someone's running water. So whoever that, let's see. Bill Mueller, can you please mute your line? Thanks.
Okay, so for PG&E's proposal, there's really kind of 2 variants. One, which we're calling the variable cost hedge, and then the other, the price cap rebate. And we'll go into details on what those are. And then for the Energy Division proposals, there's the bid cap proposal, or as it's mentioned above, elements of the fixed price forward contract. Okay, and so before we jump into details of the proposals, we wanted to outline a few objectives for both for our presentation, but then kind of the hedging component of the workshop more broadly. So for PG&E's presentation, discussing the pros and cons of the proposals under consideration, and then 2, identify how the existing proposals could be incorporated into the slice of day proposals. And then just for the workshop more broadly, discuss any new proposals. And so potentially there's parties that have thought further about this and have ideas about what else could be used for this. Okay, so we do have one slide on the Energy Division proposals before we jump into PG&E proposals. This is a fairly high-level summary, and we'll just start with the fixed price forward contract. We've thought about how this potentially could work under slice of day, but it's at this point it's really unclear to us how it could be adapted to work with it. And kind of recognizing that was one of the things that was included in the decision, we haven't identified a way to do it, but we're certainly open to stakeholder feedback and ideas on that front. The second one is the bid cap proposal. So this was to require a bid cap of greater of $300 per megawatt hour, or the resource specific default bid for all resources under RA contracts. So a couple pros and cons that come to mind for us. In terms of pros, it's very simple, right? $300 per megawatt hour. It's simple, it's easy to understand. For cons, it was unclear to us if the requirement can be legally implemented. And then even if it is legal, there's a significant administrative burden to enforcing the approach. And on this last point, we've included some additional detail that Energy Division had included in their proposal. They proposed to review the bidding by market participants and refer LSEs for non-compliance if the resources do not comply with the resource adequacy requirements per the contractual provisions. And so eventually the enforcement mechanism would be through the LSEs. Okay, so I think we're going to pause there for any questions or comments before we jump into the PG&E proposals.
If anyone has a comment or question, please put it in the chat or raise your hand. I'm not seeing anything, Luke.
Okay, all right, so we can go ahead and move forward. So Peter, are you on the line?
Yes, I am on the line. I just have to get myself off of mute.
Okay, all right, so we'll go ahead and move forward to PG&E proposals.
Yeah, and what we're going to do is basically go into a little more detail about the fact that sort of what the PG&E proposals were and how the PG&E proposals would work, providing some examples. What we're really doing here is really trying to come up with a mechanism by which essentially this hedging aspect can be incorporated if indeed the Commission wants to adopt that type of a hedging mechanism. We're not going to talk so much about whether or not it's a good idea or how good of an idea or how much of a hedge should be required by the PUC. I think all of those things are the topics that are probably ripe for discussion and should be discussed before it gets adopted. But what we're really focused on to some degree is sort of, okay, PG&E put forward a couple of mechanisms to put this to incorporate this or to have this implemented. And what we're really focused on is sort of what are those mechanisms? How do those mechanisms work? So what we initially proposed in December of 2020 was basically a variable cost hedge, which Luke referred to, and I'll go into more details as to exactly what that is. Subsequently, given feedback that we got in terms of comments, and we revised that and put forward a price cap type of rebate proposal. These are two different mechanisms. The mechanisms have something in common in that what they're trying to do is, instead of mandate a certain price that's being paid, is to put into contractual terms incentives for the resource essentially to behave a particular way in the energy market. And so it's a bit different from what the Energy Division proposal was, which was to try and require a certain amount of a certain behavior of bidding by the resource on a compliance basis, and set up an incentive type of mechanism so that the resource essentially would have the incentive to behave in the way that I think provides the hedging that the Commission requires or desires. The variable cost hedge proposal would require essentially cost to be identified, and there certainly was some pushback on that as to whether or not that was something that was a wise thing to do, particularly since some of that information is commercially sensitive or can be considered to be commercially sensitive. And so what we did was to basically come up with a price cap rebate type of proposal, which plays off of a little bit of the mechanism that Energy Division, or the proposal that Energy Division put forward. And the idea, for the most part, is that for whatever the resource or wherever the resource is, whenever the LMP at that location basically goes above a certain price, that would trigger, in the contract, it would trigger essentially a rebate back from or credit back from the resource to the LSC for whatever that difference is between essentially the LMP price and what the determination of what that cap is, or what that level is. So what we're trying to do is essentially assure that anytime prices go above a certain level, there is an automatic credit back to the LSE. So in some way to essentially to provide an incentive to the generator to make sure that the prices, or at least to bid in a way that wouldn't have that going above that price level. And so it basically is, it could be something that is determined by individual LSEs. It could be determined to some degree by the Commission in terms of everybody having the same thing. There are pros and cons of doing it each way, and we'll talk a little bit about that. So Luke, why don't we go to the next slide? The one question, to some degree, at what price? Energy Division basically threw out a price of $300. We make no judgment on that in terms of exactly what that price should be. Again, it depends upon sort of what the objectives are of adopting this mechanism and at what level. And the question also is, should that be determined by the LSE, or should that be determined by the Commission? Certainly LSEs and resources, for that matter, have an incentive to hedge. And is this really a hedging mechanism? And to what degree does this requirement fit into the hedging strategies that the LSEs may already have, or may have to modify because they have this type of a mechanism, or have this type of a requirement? And again, if the Commission sets a particular level, what level should that be set at, and how should that be determined? We're making no judgment on that, or no proposals on that per se, but it is essentially a feature of the way the mechanism would work, that you would have to have something that would trigger a price or trigger a rebate back to the LSE. So let's go to the next slide. PG&E does put some of these types of mechanisms in our contracts, and we have some of those contracts that we have signed. We've done it for some of the, we have executed contracts to some degree from Emergency Reliability OIR and from the Midterm Reliability OIR. These types of contracts are essentially things that PG&E determined what those parameters would be, or at least what should be, and essentially negotiated those types of things with the resources that it contracted with. Also, the CPE, the CPE solicitations had this option as well, and so the variable cost hedge was the mechanism that we've used to date. And the way that is laid out and how that's laid out is in the solicitation materials. So that if you want to see a very specific way of how it was laid out, you can look at those solicitation materials and have some understanding of how PG&E has tried to implement essentially the energy settlement aspect. It's in the energy settlement aspect of the solicitations, and so going forward, PG&E is likely to be using these types of mechanisms, or at least considering using these types of mechanisms going forward. And so, to some degree, because we have been thinking about this and have been using them, we thought it might make sense to sort of say, okay, this is to explain sort of this is the way we've done it and this is how we've done it. So if we can go to the next slide, we can talk about examples, specific examples of sort of how it's worked and how it's been set up. The price cap rebate, which is the second proposal that we made, was based on the concept basically is to have the difference between the LMP or the local marginal price of where the resource is located and a set trigger, essentially trigger a rebate. That rebate essentially is a credit back from the resource to the LSE. Could this work? This could work sort of for any resource subject to a price cap or any type of thing that we might want to negotiate into. And so the calculation for each hour, essentially what we were looking at in terms of calculating what that rebate is look at the maximum in each hour to look at the maximum of the price cap and the LMP price minus the cap price. And so if the LMP is below essentially the cap price essentially is the cap price minus the cap price or no rebate. In the example in the graph, essentially we've got an example here where you've got different LMPs and different LMPs, and the price cap is $400. The contracted amount, just for an example, is 10 megawatts. So the rebate only triggers in two of those hours, because it's only in 2 of those hours that the prices essentially are above that trigger. And so the calculation is done in the table. The price cap is 400. The LMP is say 480. So it's the difference times the quantity, and that's the quantity of the rebate or the credit back to the LSE from the resource on that. So that is one mechanism, the price cap mechanism, in terms of how it works in a little more specificity. If we go to the next slide, we can talk about sort of how the variable cost hedge, and this has worked for gas-fired resources, and in terms of where you have an idea or you want to have an idea to some degree of what their costs are, and specify those costs to be able to set that trigger or the level of that trigger. And what this is it's a difference between an ISO index price, sort of what the price is that you're looking at, and then sort of the difference between that and the calculated dispatch price of the resource. So this type of mechanism essentially tries to get at a dispatch price for the mechanism for the resource, and essentially then tries to trigger essentially payments based on any time the LMP is above that, triggers a rebate of the size of what that difference is. The way that has worked is, again, it's for each hour. We're looking at sort of what the maximum is of essentially 0, or the difference between the index price and the daily dispatch price. So if the index price, it could be the LMP, is above what the daily dispatch price is, then essentially that could trigger essentially what that rebate is and how that would work. There's an example there in terms of the equation of the type of way that you would come up with, or potentially come up with a way in terms of a daily dispatch price. It's a standard sort of, at what point do what is the best way to try and form a bid? It's basically looking at the heat rate times essentially times the gas cost, and then looking also then at what the GHG impacts are and the costs there, as well as adding a variable O&M. And all of those things to some degree get specified in a way that essentially hits that. So the question to some degree is, what is the index price and how is that index price set? That's the same thing to some degree as what again, it's a variable in the calculation that gets established ahead of time and which triggers essentially that rebate. And again, the table essentially shows how that calculation is done and what that calculation is. So it's a little different mechanism. It's a little more involved. It requires more information essentially from the resource and to be shared with the LSE in terms of what that is, in terms of how to be able to set the dispatch price and those sorts of things. There's also a way to be able to do this type of thing also with storage resources, and we have thought about this and have actually developed that. And if we go to the next slide, we can talk about the way it works for storage. And the idea with storage, for the most part, is storage is if it's likely to be doing be doing a daily arbitrage between sort of the lowest price hours and the highest price hours, where it wants to charge at the lowest price hours and it wants to essentially discharge at the highest priced hours. So what the mechanism would look like there would be looking at essentially what those prices are and taking the difference between the highest set of prices, the highest prices and the lowest prices, to be able to establish essentially what that payment back is and how that would work. And so the example here, it's for energy storage type of things. You to look at the high price and the low price. You include some operating costs. You also would include some efficiency. We're assuming in this example efficiency is 100%, just for the example, but you would essentially want to make sure that those efficiency costs were taken into account as well in the calculation. And so you can see in the table in terms of the way that calculation is done and how that is set up. Now, again, these are the examples that we put together and just to basically to try and explain sort of the mechanisms, how they might work. These are mechanisms that we have some experience with and have used. I think there are still some questions as to whether or not these types of mechanisms should be mandated by the PUC for RA contracts and for how much, what quantities they should be mandated for in terms of what the prices are and what the triggers are and how those are set up. So what we really have focused on is, if the commission wants to adopt a mechanism to provide some sort of hedging, what we've tried to do is to try and develop what that mechanism might look like without opining on sort of what the levels are and how much the levels should be and to what degree should this be implemented. So with that, I think that's our last slide. I think we have some questions. So let's go to questions.
Great, thanks. So Oren initially had a question in the chat, so I wanted to ask him if the dialogue that's happened in the conversation has addressed the $300 megawatt question and the additional questions and information that Peter gave in the presentation. And then Renee and Ian are after. Okay, I got that. Okay, so next I will go to Renee. She has a couple questions. And I'm not sure if Renee if you want to unmute or if you want me to read them for you.
Julia, if anybody speaks, can you please remind them to identify the organization they're with? Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. Definitely. Oh, she's trying to unmute. There is, if you should be on, if you kind of move your mouse around or your cursor around, you should see where the video button is, the camera, and the mute button's right next to it, and you can click that on or off.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I was trying to ask it on my phone instead, but I'll do it on the computer here. this is Renee Steichen with Rev Renewables. And so 2 questions. One, first, just a clarification on this. With the variable energy cost for storage, so is this envisioning that the rebate would then be 1,140? So you take the whole spread?
You would take the spread for the hours, and it would be, the rebate would be the difference between each of the hour spreads. So in the first, you're basically taking the hour ending 20, and you're matching that with hour ending 13, and you're looking at that spread, and you are essentially calculating it sort of hour by hour, and then summing up over the 4 hours.
Okay. I just see that as a I guess a challenge with, then you're taking a lot of the revenue from the storage resource, but
well, no,
Renee,
that's a good point. A lot of these mechanisms essentially do tap into the energy margin that the resource would be earning from the energy market, both in the way they're set up. Perhaps a little less so for a little less so for the hedge cap, the PG&E hedge cap proposal to some degree, and more so for certainly the variable cost and for the way it's applied to the storage. And that, to some degree, that's an impact that we'd have to be taken into account, that basically says, oh, if I'm going to basically give away my energy margin to the LSE on a rebate, I need to adjust that in my price, or at least what I think my price is going to be when I sell them that capacity. And that is going to be a feature probably of all of these types of hedging mechanisms, is that it will, to the extent that it has an impact on the margin that the resource gets to keep, the energy margin that it gets to keep, that will be reflected in the capacity cost at which they're willing to give that away, or to essentially sell that give that to the LSE.
Yeah, and then I guess, so maybe that ties to my other question of whether this is on a going forward basis or whether contracts would be renegotiated, because obviously currently the RA price doesn't cover the full operating cost, because you're assuming that energy is going to be sold, and maybe you have an energy hedge contract on in addition to your RA to be able to kind of stack up those revenue sources to make the project work. So it sounds like PG&E, you said you're doing it for going forward, but
that's correct.
I guess I'm curious on for how this would be implemented, whether
personally,
how existing contracts are going to be transferred to the new system is a bigger picture.
No, I mean that pardon me for interrupting, but I agree with you that this only makes sense to some degree to be implemented on new contracts. To go back and renegotiate existing contracts, you could do that, but that's a lot of work. It's a whole lot of work. It messes with a whole lot of, and so the question to some degree is, to what degree should this be adopted? Should it be adopted only for, say, new contracts? If it is adopted, and for what portion of new contracts? Should it be for all new contracts? Should it be for some, a portion of an LSE's portfolio that it needs to be done for? I mean, certainly LSEs, are willing to take some risk, some price risk. And to what degree do you want to try an energy price risk? And to what degree do you want to basically have this mechanism, get rid of that entirely, so that you're doing everything on a forward procurement basis, and whether or not that makes sense or not? Because if certainly hedging and the amount of hedging that parties do, either on the buy side or on the sell side, it may not be for 100% of their output. And so there's some question as to how much should this apply for and how much should it not. Those are all questions that I think need to be discussed and talked about before this gets implemented. What we really tried to focus on here is trying to identify mechanism or potential mechanisms to do that if the commission wants to go in that direction. So I hope that's helpful,
Great,
Renee.
thank you.
Thank you both. And then I see.
Yeah, those are all
Go
very
ahead.
big, meaty questions.
Very true. And so we have a lineup here. So we have Ian, Nuo, Kathleen, and Mary.
Yeah, hello, Ian White with Shell Energy. Peter, real quick question. When you refer to the index price, I may have missed this. Are you referring to the applicable generator P node, et cetera? Or are you referring to like a D-lab? What are you referring to there?
Whatever the LSC and the generator and the resource when I agree to.
Oh, okay, okay.
I mean, it's a reference. It's basically a fixed sort of reference price at which the trigger kicks.
Okay, yeah, that's helpful.
Which is a little different than sort of having a mandated price above which is the mechanism kicks in or the rebate kicks in. But that's the thought.
And the location of the price is up to the buyer and seller.
Exactly.
That's helpful. Thank you.
Luke, did you want to add anything before we go to the next question?
Oh no, I got kicked off there for a minute, so I'm back on.
All right. Nuo.
Hi, this is Noah Tom from Middle River Power. Can you hear me?
Yes. Noah.
Great. Happy New Year. Question. So Peter, you guys have some experience with this, and just trying to understand whether or not inclusion of the energy piece into cost. Have you seen sort of a trend from that of essentially increasing costs on the capacity side, as you've kind of suggested to Renee that essentially the energy margin is being sort of taken, if you will, by the LSC and as a refund. Have you seen the capacity costs go up because of that?
So you're asking in the experience have we seen that, and quite frankly, I don't know the answer to that question. I don't have the knowledge of what the contracts are or what the prices are to be able to opine one way or the other. I will tell you though that my experience as an economist is basically, okay, if I'm taking something away from one source of revenue, I need to make it up in another source of revenue. So it certainly makes a lot of sense that there would be an impact on what the capacity prices would be.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Kathleen.
Hi, yeah, thanks. This is Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. I'll save a lot of my substance for my own presentation later today, but I did want to just make sure to level set, kind of try and tease something out of what you're providing the background on the current solicitations that have the energy settlement. And I want to make sure everyone is hearing correctly that today it's an option. So there's multiple types. Okay, so I just want to level set there. And the other thing I think is important to how it's been implemented, I think fairly well, is that it is a seller can submit both multiple types. And so the buyers and the sellers can together look to see what is the most competitive outcome, what's the best outcome for that solicitation. And I think that's another really critical thing that I think was important to how it was implemented. So just wanted to highlight those two things.
Yeah, no, Kathleen, you bring up a really good point, which is we're going from the realm of where it's been implemented to date on a voluntary basis as an option to if the commission adopts something like this, to what degree are they going to mandate it? And how should it be mandated, and whether it should be mandated, and to what degree should it be mandated? And so those are important questions. I think we're going to have a wider discussion about that later during your presentation. But I think those are all legitimate questions that need to be discussed and need to be brought forth.
Great, thank you. Mary.
Hi, Mary Lynch with Constellation. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. So Peter, hi. On the issue of whether this is for contracts going forward, or whether prior contracts would need to be renegotiated. And then your comment that, clearly if you take something away, that's going to get reflected in the RA price. One thing I'm trying to think through in my mind is, if there are RA contracts out there in both worlds, one with the hedge and groups of them without, does LMP continue to work well? I mean, because you're going to have kind of two major differences in bidding strategies, I think, if you have the two types of contracts. And I guess I'm not saying you will. I'm wondering if you will. Have you thought about that at all, as what impacts it would have on overall bidding behavior and price formation if you have two flavors of RA contracts out there?
Mary, that's a good question in terms of what you're asking, and sort of what might the impact be on the energy market behavior of the resources. And I would note to some degree that we probably have a lot of different flavors of RA contracts out there now. We have RA only contracts now. We have tolling arrangements. We have those sorts of things. And so if you look at what the commission has said about this, is that we used to have a lot of tolling arrangements where essentially the LSE had direct control over the bidding behavior of the resource in the energy market. And we have moved away from tolling arrangements to much more RA only arrangements, where essentially the capacity is being provided to the LSE, but the resources essentially is retaining essentially the ability to bid in the market. And that's the thing that I think the commission to some degree is trying to think about addressing, and how to address that how do we try and get some of that back, or move in that direction where we have more of that control. I think, to answer your question, generally my general impression is in the energy market, the bidding behavior is really going to be dictated by how much competition there is in the energy market, that's perceived in the energy market. And so to the extent that there is a lot of generation in the market, in the energy market, that provides incentives essentially for generators and resources essentially to bid at a marginal cost type of rate. And generally that's what I think we see and it prevails. The question to some degree is well, then is it really necessary to have this forward type of mechanism if we have enough competition? And that's a legitimate question to a large degree. But sort of once you have less of that competition, the question is, okay, what is the incentive the bidding incentive for the resources where there is not so much competitive pressure in the energy market? And again, some generators, I'm sure some resources essentially still continue to bid at marginal cost and aren't trying to influence price. Some may be trying to influence price. I mean, because the energy market is a clearing market, if I know I'm well inframarginal, I may not have an incentive to change my behavior at all, because of the fact, even when things are tight, because prices are going to be driven up by somebody else because I'm inframarginal. And so I'm not really pushing up energy prices by my bidding behavior. So the impact of this on energy market bidding behavior, I mean, that's a good question. I think most of that is probably going to be more determined by the level of competition in the energy market than it might be, and it might be only marginally impacted by these types of contracts.
Yeah. Okay. That's super helpful, Peter. Helpful dialogue. I think we should just keep the issue on the table to make sure we kind of think through just whether there could be some unintended consequences. But I hear what you're saying, and very helpful. Thank you.
Right.
I appreciate the dialogue. Okay, Paul, you're next.
Hi. This is Paul Nelson on behalf of CLECA, just doing a quick sound check.
Okay,
Paul. So I came in a bit late, so if this issue has been discussed, my apologies. So I've got a question and a comment. Is the hedging issue separable from the slice a day construct, or is the hedging strongly linked to a slice a day reform?
From PG&E's thinking, we've always seen them to be completely separate and completely orthogonal. we see this, the commission could adopt a hedging mechanism as soon as they would want to. It wouldn't necessarily have to be tied to a particular type of RA structure. And you know, who knows? People may, you know, somebody may put forward a proposal to implement it for 2023 for new contracts.
Right.
I mean, who knows? You know, but that from PG&E's perspective, this is not at all related or not at all dependent upon slice of day. It is completely orthogonal to the slice of day discussion.
I share the same impression of what I've seen about slice of day, that the hedging is not, you know, intricately linked to the slice of day mechanisms that have been proposed. So my next sort of comment is, regardless of whatever hedging strategy mechanism that you pick, I mean, hedging is not free. It's going to cost you money for a hedge. I think it's not free. And so the next question is so for me, 100% hedging is not a cost-effective outcome, because you're going to pay a lot of money for hedging. But there is a question that I guess is trying to look at the economic nature is, how do you determine what is sort of an optimal level of hedging? And obviously, different LSEs are going to have, because of their risk profiles, will have different answers. But I think there's a discussion to help inform the commission if they're going to move down this path. I mean, obviously, especially for the utilities. I'm not sure how the issues of the jurisdiction on other LSCs, such as community choice aggregators and direct access providers, on this issue, but certainly for the fully bundled, is, you know, what is this optimal level of hedging? And I don't have a specific answer. This is not an area I've done a lot of work in, but I think that's something that needs to be addressed to try to inform the commission.
Well, let me say, Paul, that as an employee of an IOU, the commission is very interested in how much hedging the IOU is doing on behalf of bundled customers. Yeah. And that's something that gets regularly reported out to the commission in terms of what level we're doing and how much we're doing and how we're justifying that and justifying the cost. And so to some degree, I don't know that there is that same level of oversight that the commission has over other types of LSEs, either direct access or CCAs. But that may be one of the reasons why the commission may want to be going to this type of mechanism. Now, I agree with you that 100% hedging, a full hedge, basically can be very, very expensive. And that gets to the question to some degree of, you know, what is the objective that the commission is trying to get at here by adopting this, and to what level? How do you control that level? Is it by setting what the price is at which the trigger is, so that if you have, say, a $750 trigger price on the hedging type of mechanism, that'll have less of an impact than, say, if it's, say, $50. And so one way would be sort of how the commission chooses what that level is, and if it's going to choose something for everybody, or if it's going to allow each LSE to choose that and have the LSE justify to some degree what level they're choosing that, and for what contracts, in terms of what's the quantity of contracts that they're requiring it for. Is it going to be for all of the load? Is it going to be for only a portion of the load? Yeah. So those are the types of things that I think, you know, again, if the commission is going to go in this direction, those are things that need to be discussed and put forth and debated.
Yeah, and then, you know, what you mentioned, if they dictate a price, then there's going to be the issue of how's FERC going to think about this if it impacts, you know, their CAISO market that they regulate. From
PG&E's perspective, we get away from mandating behavior in the ISO market by making it an incentive structure for a rebate. So to some degree, it's a voluntary contract that is being gotten into. It's getting into, and those prices to some degree you could argue are reflected in what the capacity is that's paid by the LSE.
Right.
You know, is that infringing on the jurisdiction? Well, it's not saying that the resource has to bid in a particular way in the ISO market. It's only saying that it's providing an incentive to bid in a particular way.
Yeah, that certainly changes the construct of it in terms of you know, FERC concerns. So, good discussion, and thank you, Peter.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks, Peter. So that's all Matthew just raised his hand. Matthew?
Hey, Peter, this is Matt Barmack with Calpine.
Hey, Matt.
Hey, I had a question for you. So under this kind of more voluntary approach that you outlined, do you imagine that an LSE could sort of put forward a hedging plan that involved other instruments, like sort of separate energy contracts or separate energy hedges, you know, that are distinct from its RA purchases?
You know, Matt, that's a good question. I would say that because what you're pointing to is you're saying, look, if the commission wants hedging by LSEs, is this the best way to do it? Is this the most efficient way to do it? You know, or are there other mechanisms? I mean,
I mean, for example, I'm sure you do a bunch of energy hedging that's unrelated to RA. I'm not that familiar with PG&E's hedging program to be able to affirm or deny that. Yeah.
But there are a lot of other instruments that could be used to hedge.
Yeah.
And the real question I think you're asking is this the best mechanism for if the commission wants to see hedging? Is this the best mechanism to be used for that?
Yeah, that's the question. Do you have any thoughts?
Well, to some degree, it gets at sort of how much oversight does the commission want to have, and what kind of oversight does the commission have on LSE procurement?
Yeah.
Certainly, it has a lot more oversight on IOU procurement than it does over direct access providers and CCA procurement.
Yeah.
And the question to some degree is, you know, does the commission have the jurisdiction to be able to look at and require CCAs to essentially present a hedging plan to the PUC for its review?
Yeah.
Using whatever instruments that are available.
Yeah. Well, I mean, to me, it's actually a bit of an open question whether they can sort of backdoor a hedging requirement through RA, which is you know, basically what you're proposing.
Well, it's what the commission is proposing.
Yeah.
And I don't know that the commission is necessarily proposing it as to make sure that resources or that LSEs are hedged. They may also be thinking about what the market price, the energy market impact is.
Yeah.
Of that, because certainly the ISO's market power mitigation only goes to local market power. It does not go to system market power.
Yep.
And it may be a way for the commission to be thinking about how do we try and influence how much market power is actually exercised in the market.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Great. Thank you both. Okay. I don't see any other comments or raised hands, so I will hand it back to you, Peter and Luke.
I think that is pretty much our presentation. I don't know that we have any more. Don't have any more prepared slides, but we're certainly happy to answer any questions and engage any other further dialogue. So I don't know if we want to move on to the next presentation or what we want to try and do at this point.
We might, because we have we do have an hour. Well, I guess we could go to 11:30. We can go to well, this is what we were debating earlier about the hour for and now we have it. So, Kathleen, do you want to go?
What do you guys want to do?
Let's do this. And Nancy and Dariush, are you okay with moving to Vistra?
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks all for your impromptu flexibility. Okay, go ahead,
Okay,
Kathleen.
I'm going to work on sharing my screen then. Give me a second.
And thank you, Peter and Luke, for your presentation and the great dialogue. Keep it coming.
Julia, can you confirm that you can see the slides?
I can see the slides. They're not in presenter mode yet, but whatever's easier for you. There you go.
There we go. Okay, great. And just so you know, I only have one screen, so if there are any questions, can you just flag them for me?
You got it.
Okay, awesome. Alrighty, everyone. My name is Kathleen Colbert from Vistra, and I am looking forward to jumping in now. So I'm glad we had time. I think this will flow better. Everything's working out great. Okay, so I will get it going. The two things that Vistra wanted to tee up is both responding to the hedging component element of the decision, as well as the transactability piece. I just kind of quoted a couple things providing context for the directions for the workshops, including transactability and the hedging component, to kind of give some and to highlight those are the two pieces of the decision that we're going to address today. Just a reminder, we've been presenting this pretty much on every time we present. It's the principles that Vistra believes is required for a well-functioning market, and I will have those there for your reference afterwards, but we'll not go through them today because I've already done that a couple times. Alrighty, so let's keep going on hedging, I guess. Similarly to Luke, I wanted to start with the decision. Luke, you went through the principles, so I won't reread them. I will just say that principle 1 is what this element of hedging is directly tied to. When the decision talks through its rationale for principle 1, it provided some of these quotes, which I found helpful, and I think they are different than the ones that Luke cited. I also saw that one, also, this is working out very serendipitously as well. The first one that jumped out at me as particularly relevant to highlight is that the Commission found it critical that a future framework include a component that links RA to a resource's energy bidding behavior, so as to increase the cost effectiveness of RA. Another quote that I thought was really helpful was that the Commission finds it critical that a future RA framework include a means to ensure that RA is linked with energy bidding behavior to balance reliability with minimizing costs, and that the Commission maintained that we should consider a hedging requirement in these workshops, which we are doing today. I wanted to take a step back and tee this up for the group. And I actually really appreciate the G&E's presentation, because you teed this up and provided, a great summary and kind of recap of what our prior proceeding discussed and what those options were and kind of how their function what's today's landscape. For the purpose of our Q&A or back and forth today, I want to elevate this and ask the question, what issue are we trying to solve in this component? We believe that it's critical that we discuss on hedging what type of risk are we concerned with mitigating and who's at risk. So first, on the type of risk, are we talking about, are we concerned with mitigating financial exposure? Are we concerned with mitigating physical exposure? Vistra's understanding from the record and what we're doing today is that this group and the Commission, we believe that the concern in this discussion is of financial exposure. Just want to iterate that I don't believe we're talking about physical exposure. We believe that the RA must offer obligation and other rules under contracts, etc. Leave everyone sufficiently confident that physical exposure is addressed through the RA program. Any concerns that we have with the physical exposure, i.e. any of our reliability concerns, we've been talking about in all the other workshops, so I'm not going to belabor them. And I'm not trying to say that we don't have those concerns. I just want to focus on why are we talking about hedging. Okay, so now that we're talking about mitigating financial exposure. Who's at risk? Are we talking about the load serving entities? Are we talking about the resource owners? Or are we talking about end use consumers? I'm going to start with end use consumers because that's who I hope we're mostly talking about. That's what I believe we're mostly talking about. But I want to highlight something that I think may be getting buried, is that the risk to end use consumers is largely dependent on the type of retail product that consumer is on. And I do want to know, I do hear some background noise. So if you're not muted, just wanted to let you know, double check. So let me say that again. The risks to end use consumers are largely dependent on the type of retail product the consumer is on, which for those who have retail experience understand that those retail products vary and they are not necessarily directly tied to the wholesale market prices. So I think that's really critical to keep in the back of your mind. If the concerns, let's talk about what could a couple of the concerns be related to end use consumers. If the concern is with a retail product unnecessarily exposing consumers to risks resulting from wholesale market outcomes, we do not believe, so Vistra does not believe this is an RA issue, but it is a retail issue. Second concern that we want to kind of bring out of the depths of maybe the thinking here is if we're concerned with the effectiveness of the CAISO's mitigation program being effective to moderate market power within the CAISO markets, we do not believe this is an RA issue. Instead, this is an issue that needs to be discussed in a CAISO stakeholder process. Now let me go to the load serving entities. I want to emphasize that buyers can enter hedges through financial or physical energy markets today to hedge their forward exposures. There are risk mitigation tools that exist. There's an additional one that PG&E was talking through how they have also introduced an option to include an energy settlement component in some of the products that are included in their solicitation. So I'm not trying to say that isn't another option out there today. So apologies for leaving it off, but emphasizing that these tools exist and can be entered into and are entered into. So what might the concern be? So if the concern is that financial exposures could lead to an LSE defaulting where consumers revert back to the providers of last resort, if the commission's concern is that leading to a market disruption, Vistra does not believe that is an RA issue. It is a retail issue. Finally, the other category of potential entities exposed to risk are resource owners. That is, that's Vistra within the California landscape is a supplier and developer. Suppliers, we can enter hedges through financial or physical energy markets today to hedge our forward exposures. We can also offer into the solicitations those optional products that include an energy settlement if that's what's most cost effective, what's most competitive for that solicitation process. So what might the concern be? So if the concern here is that a seller did not appropriately hedge and consequently is losing money on the investment, once we get to the daily markets, again, we do not think this is an RA issue. It's an inherent market risk and one that we are incentivized to mitigate to the greatest extent possible. The proposal that we want to make today for the workshop and for the element on hedging is that we are proposing that retail market concerns should be moved into a retail or direct access docket. We believe that the financial risks that LSEs and or end use consumers are exposed to, that I just covered some of those, what those concerns might be, all boil down to concerns with retail markets. Vistra proposes the Commission discuss its concerns with defaulting LSEs or unfair rates being passed through retail products to consumers in a retail or direct access docket. For the concerns that are related to the CAISO market operations, we are proposing that concerns with CAISO market power mitigation design be taken up at CAISO. Vistra believes that if the driving concern is the effectiveness of the CAISO mitigation paradigm, that this is a concern with CAISO's tariff and its operations. While we personally continue to believe that CPUC RE rules that might incorporate a financial energy hedging requirement, and I'm just going to emphasize requirement, or an energy bid cap requirement are not needed or appropriate to mitigate market power in the energy markets. Here's a couple reasons. One, CAISO has the responsibility for ensuring energy markets are protected from economic withholding concerns. CAISO has a mitigation paradigm set up to address this concern. It includes local market power mitigation. It includes bid caps. We believe that these are well functioning, although we are open to CAISO evaluating whether enhancements are needed. If this is a concern, there are paths for entities to ask CAISO to launch an effort to look into this and discuss it in a robust stakeholder process that's transparent and open, and we are always supportive of that kind of an approach. Let's look into it. Let's work with the CAISO. But finally, I do want to emphasize that one of the things in some of the quotes, because specifically saying that the commission believes that it needs to link RA to a resource's energy bidding behavior, and Vistra believes that that already is happening. There is an energy component already that comes with the RA obligation by way of the must offer obligation. So just to summarize, our proposal for these concerns that have been raised and discussed is that the commission or other parties who share this concern should request the CAISO consider this issue in its stakeholder process. We do propose that we should, but like, what should we be proposing should be done for an energy hedge discussion? As I mentioned, there are options today for buyers and sellers to mitigate their risks. We continue to believe in most cases that the competitive supplier and buyers can most cost effectively hedge their financial risks through existing financial or physical markets rather than an RA contract, including an energy hedge. I'm emphasizing most cases because it's going to lead to where we're going. We believe it's important to allow more cost-effective hedging to be performed by sellers if it can result in a more cost-competitive offer to minimize cost to consumers. This is very vanilla, but I'm going to say it. Consumers benefit when incentives are aligned such that bids and offers are most competitive, and that we need to avoid artificial limits. And when I say artificial limits, I mean a requirement that a specific type of hedge be entered into, a requirement that a bid cap that is in bundles somehow into an RA obligation that touches on an energy market rules. Those are artificial limits that reduce market efficiency. It could reduce market efficiency in the CAISO's energy markets. It's going to reduce market efficiency in the RA markets, which I think we've already done a great job of participants today fleshing that out of why the cost shift and how it probably isn't going to produce any kinds of savings or protections in the energy markets, but rather shift costs in the RA markets in a way that is unadvantageous for consumers. So what are we proposing? Vistra's proposing that the CPUC should not require an energy hedge component in a bundled RA contract. The reason we're proposing that it not be a requirement is that this could be less cost-effective outcome for consumers. And as I mentioned earlier, I hope that's who we're here advocating for. And so that's why we're proposing that the bounds upon which we are discussing a hedge component not be a requirement, but instead be an option. Vistra proposes the CPUC add to the risk mitigation tools available to buyers and sellers an option that allows for an energy hedge, such that solicitations can allow suppliers to offer both and buyers to consider both. And this was one of the things I wanted to level set on PG&Es, because I think this is an important element of how it's being implemented, is that a seller can submit both an RA-only offer and an RA plus an energy settlement offer. Really what drives, or one of the elements driving what is most competitive within that solicitation is how sophisticated, how good might that hedge be, that the hedges that are planned in order to support the resources operations. And I'm going to kind of call an elephant out in the room. If the hedge that's required is either not needed or it is not a good hedge, it will increase the risks of providing the RA. which will increase the RA cost. And we don't believe that that's the right outcome in a well-functioning RA market. However, if that energy settlement hedge that's an option can mitigate risks without increasing the risks, i.e. it's a good hedge or a better hedge than can be entered into elsewhere, then that's going to be a more competitive RA offer. And so having the ability to offer both and have the buyer and seller look at what's best for consumers is I really think one of the things working well. And so we're proposing that it be explicitly adopted and contemplated under the RA paradigm rather than kind of how it has been done just through largely implementation. That concludes my slides, and thank you for letting me go through all of them. They were all related, and I appreciate the time. Now I'm happy to open it up.
Thank you, Kathleen. I'm looking for some questions. Nick, go ahead.
Hey, thanks, Julia and Kathleen. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hey, Kathleen, thanks for the presentation. I think it's a helpful discussion of some of the policy considerations here. I wanted to just ask for some clarification on this proposal. The proposal to me seems very similar to the status quo today, where there's an option for LSEs and generators to have contract terms that are RA only or bundled. Maybe there's a distinction I'm missing here. I just wanted to ask if you could touch on that.
Yeah, no, thanks, Nick. And transparently, I also want to open this up to maybe some of the CCAs or ESPs, the buyers, to answer that too, because I think it's a great question. It's one I'd like a little dialogue on. Our perspective is that it's largely status quo, but by including it explicitly in the RA framework, it gives us a chance as a stakeholder community, as well as the CPUC, to discuss and evaluate what that energy settlement option is. While it is happening today, it's happening largely as an implementation piece. So there's not a really robust record about, well, what should the energy settlement methodology be used for different resource types? And I think that there is efficiency and improvements that can be made by having a record around this, because as I mentioned, it's all the kind of, how good is that hedge, right? And so one LSE comes up with, here's what I think is a good hedge. I think Peter highlighted something important in response to Ian when Ian asked about the index price, that approach allows for negotiation, that allows for a lot of flexibility. I don't know if I don't really think there is a record on that, on how the commission thinks an energy settlement bundled into an RA as an option, an optional RA product, should function. And maybe there is more of a record than we are aware of, but I'm not aware of one. And so I think it gives an opportunity for everyone to come together and kind of come up with principles and best practices for what that option would look like. The other thing is, while I know it is in the IOUs, or it's at least in a couple of the IOUs, procurement as an option, I do not know if everyone provides the option. I think if you were to take it a step farther, the commission could require an option to transact that product rather than a requirement. So those are just two thoughts that I have, and I'd like to see if there's any other anyone else who wants to respond to that and kind of go into a dialogue.
Go ahead,
so
Eric.
Could I just ask one clarifying follow-up, Kathleen?
Sure.
It sounds like the proposal is to essentially set some standards around how energy settlement would work. And so if an LSE and a generator wanted to enter into an energy settlement, they might be obligated to follow that standard, but it would still just be optional. Am I getting that right?
I think you're getting that correct. I think that having the rules be flexible and allow flexibility has advantages. And like we talked about the index price, well, maybe that's negotiable. Is it a DLAP? Is it a P node? I think a record needs to be built. Stakeholders need to discuss it, and everyone should be confident that the energy settlement methodology is the appropriate methodology for the option that is offered.
Thanks, Nick. Thanks, Kathleen. I've also seen that Eric has raised his hand.
Yeah, thank you. So I think in part to answer these questions that are going on, is this something that is kind of the status quo? I think the answer is yes. I don't think there's anything that prohibits somebody from doing this type of arrangement today. Effectively, what you're saying is I've bought capacity and I bought energy from you at some given price. And that people can do that transaction today. I think the difficulty here, and I think the important part about this being an option, is the idea that if you make this a requirement, you are presuming that this is the most cost-effective manner to meet your customers' RA and hedging requirements all at once, as opposed to using multiple different methodologies. One may be strictly an RA capacity deal, and another one is strictly an energy hedge type mechanism, and it's the sum of those that you're trying to minimize for your customers' benefit. So to me, that's really where the question is here is, do we either believe that this is going to be the least costly methodology to meet that need for customers, or do we believe that there is some other reason that it's necessary to have this type of a mechanism for some other reason other than hedging customer costs? Is there some other reason that we think is a failure of the RA program? And I would note that typically where that has come from was from the import RA discussions of things being bid at the price cap, and a concern as to whether or not that resource would actually deliver energy if called upon at that price, or if it was just fake capacity. I think the problem internally is much less of an issue with regard to that, because internal resources, if they're in a local area, are subject to the ISO's local market power mitigation if constraints bind. And if they're really trying to do that internally, a price it at 1,000 and never get dispatched, well, they're not getting any other opportunity to sell that energy elsewhere, because to be able to export it out of the ISO, they've got to get it scheduled through the market anyhow. So if they're not clearing their bid price within the ISO market to try to export it, then they're not exporting it. So it's kind of, there's an illogic there about an internal resource being able to execute that same type of a plan as an import type of a resource. So I'm not sure that that's the problem. And that leads me back to the discussion of, is this really the most economic way to meet a customer hedge? And I think that's kind of what Peter alluded to a bit earlier as well, is if you take away opportunity for a resource to make energy profit, you can expect that to end up in the price of capacity. So we have to consider those trade-offs as we figure out what is the most cost-effective manner to do that. So sorry, that was a little bit lengthy, but I just wanted to thoughts out there.
No, I really appreciate it. It's very consistent with, and I think what I feel very positive that I'm hearing some consistency on this. I appreciate all those thoughts, Eric. I agree. And that's why this is what we're proposing. Is it be an option? We ensure that we're allowing parties to find the best options for their portfolio. And I went back to my CAISO slide. You raised some good points. We need to make sure that we are thinking about where we need to be discussing concerns. If it's bidding at the cap, if it's that LMPM isn't working correctly, if it's that we need, system market power, which is coming up this year. Let's focus in the venue where that's going to be discussed. So thank you. I just wanted to respond and say completely agree, and that's why we're proposing to make sure we're discussing the concerns and their potential solutions in the right venue. CAISO concerns at CAISO, retail concerns in a retail docket.
Thank you, Eric and Nick, and thanks, Kathleen. And just please remember to state who you're with too. And the Barbara might know you. All right, I see Ian and then Jean.
Yeah, Ian White with Shell Energy again. Kathleen, thanks for this. I think this has sparked a lot of interesting contemplation on my part. I think at the beginning, when you specifically speak to what problem are we trying to address, and for tailored to who? Is it the ratepayer? Is it the LSE, whether it's an IOU, a CCA, or an ESP, or is it the resource owner? I think that you're right with respect to your perspective here, is that, and I think that Eric is substantially, he brings a great point up, is this the most cost-effective way to hedge a problem that probably looks different depending upon what we're getting at or what we're looking at. So I just wanted to mention that, and I think that this brings up a lot of good points, and I also appreciate the fact that we had a good discussion in PG&E's section about bundling energy and capacity, and somehow tying the dispatch of energy to the transacted capacity largely will, raise the capacity component of that RA price. So that's all I had. But yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Ian.
Janine?
Hi. So this is Jean from San Jose Clean Energy. To begin with, I want to be clear that we as an organization, are evaluating all these ideas. We don't have a position. This is just in the spirit of dialogue. But, basically following on what I think everybody's saying, but just maybe trying to make it clearer. One concern that I think we have to be very sort of cognizant of or to address up front is, if what we're trying to address is concerns about market power in the energy market, we really have to look at, if we apply mechanisms on the energy market, but don't have any mechanisms on the RA side, then what are we really accomplishing? So it's not to say that we shouldn't be looking at these issues. These are important issues. And in particular, I agree with Eric that we should focus on where the particular concerns were. But my concern is, if we have concerns about market power, addressing them in one market without addressing them in the other market is ineffective. It will just result in a shifting of the concern from one market to the other market. And since, generally, I've had more concerns just based on our own experience in terms of market power in the RA market, I am really concerned about, focusing on additional protections in the energy market without focusing on protections in the RA market, because that will just exacerbate problems that already exist on the RA side.
Well, thank you for your perspective.
Yeah, that's great.
Maybe Julia, I'll just add one thought that sparked while Sean was talking, was that I think, I'm saying if, I heard an if, I think one of the really, I think before, I completely agree with what you just said. Part of the benefit of saying, okay, well, let's make this a priority at CAISO to look into, I do believe it's already on the slate to look into, is getting analysis and data provided to show if there are concerns with how the market power mitigation paradigm is operating, and if there are, what they are, when they happen. I mean, that all of those questions need to be answered and looked into, and that's why we really believe a robust stakeholder process, looking into them, is the right place to do it. And if there's consensus here that we need to make that a priority, then I'm happy to join in with the other parties asking and the CAISO to do so.
I'm scrolling for hands up and comments and Ian.
If you don't see any, I'd like to make a request just because, and it's funny, these are our perspectives from our participation and from what we've seen on what the concerns are. I would note that even PG&E kind of recapped some of the energy division proposals, discussed other proposals were responsive to concerns. It would be really great if it's at all possible for someone from the energy division to share if these concerns that were raised in the prior proceeding, if you still have them, and how you feel about us focusing them into these more direct venues. Since this is really responsive, I think, to that concern, I just wanted to make a request for that, if that's possible.
Hi, Kathleen. This is Jamie Gannon. I'm listening in and appreciate the discussion on this topic. I think Energy Division, does still have these concerns regarding hedging and does, strongly think that there needs to be this component kind of discussed and contemplated as part of the reform structure. And I think there was a fair amount of discussion, as recapped by Peter and yourself, on this topic in terms of balancing reliability with minimizing cost to ratepayers. So I'll stop there. I'm just kind of in listening mode, and I think we do want to make it clear we do still have this concern.
Great, thank you, Jamie.
Thank you, Jamie. There's
Hi, this is Brian Beering for ACP. Can I jump in?
Go ahead, Grant, and then Patrick, you're next.
Great, thank you. Brian Beering for American Clean Power. Kathleen, thank you for the presentation. I found it very informative in terms of just the framing of this issue. In particular, the discussion you had with Nick around, whether this is an option or is it a requirement as part of the, RA contracting. And I guess I'm trying to put this into the context of one of our key issues, which is getting the IRP capacity contracted, built, and online in the time frame that the commission has directed. I'm wondering if you were to see there to be a requirement for hedging, would you see that as being disruptive to getting that IRP capacity under contract in the near term?
Hey, Brian, that's a great question. I haven't done a lot of thinking on how this relates to IRP. Because I've mostly been focused on the RA paradigm. So if it's all right, I'll answer for RA and say my intuition is it would have impacts to the longer term procurement, but my gut is a requirement would make providing RA a greater risk. And so the risks will get priced in and the costs will shift the RA up. I think that the worse or the more suboptimal the hedge, the worse that results will look. And then what I believe is what my intuition says for IRP is that even if it's not an option, quote unquote, not a requirement for IRP contracts, the risks, it depends on how long that contract would be, right? Because even once you get into a long-term contract, you have to think about, well, eventually I'll roll off into merchant operations. And so thinking about that risk from that perspective would be built into the lifetime of that asset, your projections for the full life cycle, depending on the length of your contract. If that little detailed, but I hope that made sense. So I do think the risks, even if it's not an IRP requirement, would get baked in, make that more difficult and riskier to effectuate. If it's a requirement in IRP, I think you would see those risks throughout the entire contract that is immediately or initially being discussed. And while I don't know if it's a wholesale increase to RA costs because the risks haven't been increased across the board. Does it just make RA more costly? Have we just increased RA rents, or does it make it more difficult to execute contracts? That's the piece that I hear you asking, and I don't have that crystal ball, but I do think it would at a minimum increase costs in a way that doesn't provide any additional value, which feels unfair.
That's helpful. Thank you, Kathleen. I think, we're seeing contracts do all of it, IRP, RA, RPS. And so I think trying to think of it holistically is the point I was trying to raise. So I appreciate the thoughts on that.
And Brian, if you don't mind, can you repeat your full name and your organization again? I think there was a little bit of cutting out, so I just want to make sure we all heard that.
Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, it's Brian Beering with the American Clean Power Association of California.
Great, Brian. Okay, Grant, you're next.
Yeah, good morning. This is Grant McDaniel with Wellhead. Just volunteer a little information here. We have 10 sites located in Northern California, Central California, and Southern California. Mitigation, they're all local areas, but they're mitigated 15 to 20% of all hours, day ahead and real time, which is quite a bit. And I just offer that up. It's an anecdote, but it's something that, Energy Division should be looking at that data as to how often and what hours get mitigated, as you mentioned, because, exercising market power, if you're in a local area, is almost impossible. There's a lot of mitigated hours. Not that we would, I'm just saying that's the number of hours that get mitigated. It's quite a few.
Thank you, Grant. Patrick.
Hi, Patrick Cunningham with the Public Advocate's Office. Just want to put some of my thoughts out there too. We've been looking into PG&E's proposals here and looking at Energy Division's old proposals, and especially with the variable cost hedge, that was particularly interesting to me because it had a lot of ideas about least cost dispatch that we enforce with the IOUs. It could even have the potential of helping out energy prices as a whole. But yeah, as we looked into it and the discussion we've had so far, there seems to be a lot of potential for additional costs going into the RA contracts beyond just the difference in energy revenue, all the cost of risk and illiquidity and whatnot. But the fact that there's a handful of energy settlement contracts out there and means that we can look at how those perform after we get a decent amount of data out of them. So and it might be a good idea to keep that energy settlement as an option rather than a requirement for now, and revisit this later once we can work with PG&E to see kind of how those contracts performed and whatnot. And I also agree with Peter that this doesn't need to be a slice of day issue. This is something that could be brought up in the RA rulemaking later on once more data is available, and we can determine if maybe this is a good idea or maybe it's just increasing costs with no net benefit. I just wanted to put that out there. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. Noah.
Hi, this is Noah Tom from Middle River Power again. Hey, Patrick, just following up on that, I'm trying to think through how this workshop process can help provide the record on whether there's actual cost savings at the end of the day if hedging were to be implemented or adopted as part of the RA framework. Any thoughts on how we get data for such analysis?
And Patrick, right before you enter that, Grant, can you please mute? Thank you.
I know, this is Patrick again. Yes, that would be difficult to determine. We'd have to look at how much data gets out there and see. Of course, if it's a requirement, it should affect the entire market price, and we could see how that shifts at all. Granted, there's more than a couple of variables that go into that. It would be difficult, but we could compare the if energy settlement contracts have been higher than what they would have been after we account for the settlement amounts. I'm not too certain I can have a complete answer on that one, though.
And maybe the same question to Jamie on, Energy Division expressed its continuing concern of hedging. How do we help the commission with this endeavor? with data.
Yeah, thanks, Noah. I think one of the things we've struggled with is really energy division staff is really getting a clear picture of the magnitude of the problem. And so I think, given all the work that everybody's doing, but, just the resources and the ability for us to do a deeper dive into, what that picture looks like, we were unable to get a data request out to LSEs to get a picture of, all load serving entities, hedging, plans, as well as, the strength of those hedges that they have in place. And I think that would help to inform kind of what additional kind of elements may be needed. And so having that data and really, analyzing it and communicating that back out would be probably a very, very helpful step in this kind of discussion. So, and I'll also note that we've also struggled with what that data request really looks like, and how to grab, how to ask for the right kind of components, so that we're asking for the useful information that's relevant to, analyzing the potential risks. Yeah.
Great, thank you. And this, Kathleen, just be mindful that I do have another section. I'd like to see, Julia, are there a lot of people with their hands up still, or can I move on?
Go ahead. And thank you, Jamie and Patrick. Thanks, Noah.
And Noah, yeah, thank you all. I really appreciate it. So I'll just wrap up this section and say that we believe maintaining the energy hedge as an option in the RA, as an RA plus energy settlement offer, is the approach that best meets Principle 1 by minimizing the costs. As a requirement, we believe it increases those costs, and so just wanted to round that out the discussion and summarize in that manner. Moving on, the next piece that I want to talk about is Principle 3. We read transactability item into Principle 3, and I'll explain why. So just as a reminder, Principle 3 is to balance granularity and precision in meeting hourly RA needs with a reasonable level of simplicity and transactability. A quote that I thought was helpful, I wanted to highlight from the decision, was, "We seek a framework that appropriately balances granularity of meeting hourly RA needs with a reasonable level of simplicity and transactability to minimize the complexity of the RA program." So Vistra believes the current RA framework is largely workable with specific needs that we should be pursuing targeted improvements. We believe the current RA construct is largely workable, and we want to propose that any framework, any slice of day framework, be adopted with as little need to change commercial negotiations and contracting as possible to support transactability. We recognize there are real reliability challenges facing California's RA program that do require review and change. However, we believe that incremental improvements can address them through improved requirement determination, which is why we've been focusing so much in these workshops on, okay, how do we do these requirements? What is the need for the periods where we have a reliability risk? The second one is improved counting rules. We completely agree that that's really meaningful. I think that's also clear. Other parties feel similarly, because that's another main focus of all of our discussions, keep going back there. Finally, we can see that there is a need, or there could be a need for new after the fact ex post sufficiency tests if additional slices that pose reliability risks are added to the RA product. Any framework adopted should improve on reliability while respecting that to achieve an efficient and cost-effective market, outcome, the granularity should be limited and as much of current contracting maintained as possible. We think this is consistent with CPUC direction that any framework should have a reasonable level of simplicity and transactability to minimize the complexity. So we need to be mindful of what's the level of granularity, and we need to be mindful of how do we maintain the kind of all the infrastructure around contracts to the extent possible. We've shown this in the past. I just wanted to kind of highlight, we're again recognizing challenges to reliability. We've talked through that in one of the earlier workshops. Workshops 3 and 4, county rules covered the first challenge. Need allocation workshop 8 covers the second challenge here. So I'm going to focus though on challenges to RA market efficiency and our proposed solutions to improve those. The challenge that we think that there is a very real challenge that CPUC RA and IRP, as well as CAISO's RA and CPM, are not sufficiently coordinated and aligned. It's one of our principles in this effort and reform that we should be seeking consistency across these rules to reduce regulatory uncertainty, complexity, and administrative costs, because that will all lead to more cost-effective and, frankly, reliable outcomes. We think this is an issue that overarches all of the workshops, highlighting it here. The last one is really focused on this transactability issue. Our challenge is that, these discussions exploring alternatives seem not to be very consistent with kind of the bundled nature of RA and how it's contracted. We think that any framework needs to recognize that any changes to valuing resource capacity value, to setting up these frameworks for a system need must apply to local needs, and it's going to inform flex needs. And we need to think about it holistically because that's how we contract. Why transactability and liquidity matters. I'm going to start using the word liquidity because I think that's what I hope everyone walks away with. One of the biggest factors to harming the ability to transact the RA product is introducing so much granularity to the product such that competition is not robust within the product requirements. What I mean by this is increasing slices or unbundling products will harm liquidity. Harming liquidity has an adverse impact on the efficiency and the cost effectiveness of the outcome of any market. Harming liquidity results in a less competitive market that can result in suboptimal outcomes for buyers and sellers, and that eventually those suboptimal outcomes will trickle down and impact end-use consumers. A second factor I want us to think about is that the ability to understand the price for a good. So we're talking RA, we're talking dollar per kilowatt month today is sold, what that price is relative to its contractual obligation. Increasing complexity under the RA program in a way that really the buyers alone are exposed to that will drive resource valuations that are not transparent to the sellers. Lack of transparency to the sellers will make it difficult for sellers of any of these energy limited resources. So i.e. not anyone who is developing and trying to sell resources that are not thermals, where the additional slices are adding this increased level of complexity and granularity. It will make it more difficult for the sellers of those resources to be able to mitigate those resources' energy limitations to provide the best value asset for reliability. A complicated compliance framework for LSEs that is separate from the seller's obligation makes it difficult for sellers to predict commercial outcomes. That an increased uncertainty will never result in the most optimal or efficient market outcome. I just want to emphasize that the more complicated so if you were to take the framework and say, okay, fine, we're going to apply every single thing to a seller that we are applying to the LSE, which we haven't been proposed, it's not proposed in any of the proposals, but even if you were to, I'm just highlighting, if you were to do that, it's just it makes that obligation more costly. It's more costly to provide that service because of the increased risks. And I think that I would interpret that similar relationship that buyers will be exposed to. The more complicated their compliance risks, the more granularity, the more complexity, It'll increase their compliance risks, which will overall increase their costs.
Hold on a second. I hear someone that's not muted. Can you all please mute again? Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks. A third factor is that RA capacity is based on a standard capacity product concept that allows fungibility of the product. What do I mean by that? An NQC megawatt should equal an NQC megawatt. Adding additional slices will move the RA framework away from the idea that the RA contract is a standard capacity product. If additional slices are added, then resources eligible for replacement under RA contract will likely be limited since its resource will have a different profile. As a group, we need to recognize this risk, the risk that 24 slices introduces the most risk that the RA capacity is not fungible, and this will reduce and consequently reduces liquidity, harming secondary market outcomes. I want to give you a couple examples so that you understand what I'm saying and the risk I'm trying to highlight. So, for example, we can see potential adverse impacts could occur if, for example, a wind resource may not be able to replace its capacity from a solar resource because the solar's energy profile is less than the wind's energy profile. Let me give an example with storage. A storage resource may not be able to replace its capacity from a solar or wind resource because the solar or wind's energy profiles are fixed, whereas storage has the flexibility to show up to its maximum output in different slices. We believe in the standard capacity product framework. We think that NQC should be fungible once it's appropriately set. We believe in the standard capacity framework rather than one that creates silos where the product can only be transacted among same or limited technologies, because this harms liquidity, which harms competition. We think it's imperative to adopt a framework that allows for RA capacity to be fungible to allow liquidity in these markets. I have one more slide and then I'll open it up. The final factor that we'd like to be considered is that RA resources must be allowed to take planned outages to ensure that they can maintain the resources at levels that can support reliable operations. There are 100% POSO rules right now that the CAISO implements. We want to raise here that increases RA risks, since the risk of not being able to take a needed outage increases potential maintenance costs and increases risks of forced outage due to plant trouble by rejecting an outage. We continue to believe that a well-functioning RA design should include rules that account for the risk of resources needing planned outages in a market where substitution is not available or extremely limited and difficult to find. And I'm adding that because I don't want to, I would like not to get into a debate of if that substitution is available. Largely our experience is when it's needed, it is not. We think that a better RA design and what the RA program should be doing is incorporating the planned outage without substitution risk in the loss of load expectation study, as has been proposed in the 2-slice proposal. This will negate the need for 100% POSO rules by the CAISO. Allowing for retiring of this inefficient rule and ensuring the risks are appropriately accounted for in the RA planning requirements will increase transactability of the RA product and ensure a more cost-effective RA outcome. Next, I'm going to go into our proposal to ensure the transactability is maintained. I want to ask if there's any clarifying questions and just ask to hold any reflections until I'm done with my proposal slides, just given timing. Are there any clarifying questions?
Yes, Sergio, do you want to go ahead?
No, I'd rather hear the summary and then ask. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks.
Great. Well, let me just do that, and then I'll open it up.
Okay.
So FISFRA is proposing that reliability enhancements can be achieved through changes to the PRM determination method, updates to measuring net qualifying capacity, measuring reliability value, and improving risks modeled in the loss of load expectation. We've discussed that ad nauseum in the earlier workshops, so I'm just going to move to the next bullet. We think that other slices reliability enhancements can be applied through adding an additional after the fact CPUC validation for slices where there was identified a loss of load risk in the LOLE study that we believe should be being performed regularly. Just caveat noting that it is reasonable to apply adjustments. We agree it's reasonable to apply adjustments to the NQC values to estimate expected output in these additional slices. However, the specific method is highly dependent on whether we go with a 2-slice or a 24-slice. So we just want to echo and support the request for determining a path forward and then having an additional forum to go into those details. More generally for transactability, contracts and showings should maintain status quo to support liquidity to the extent possible. It should have a single NQC per showing period. The must offer obligation should be 8,760 when physically available. I'm considering when you hit your use limit that you're not available. So I'm being a little general, but I mean consistent with CAISO MU. Pricing should reflect the relative difference in reliability expected from different resources based on the resource specific capabilities. And finally, we believe that we need to respect existing contracts where a change in law would not necessitate reopening contracts, and any new contract execution rules would apply. I mean, the questions that were asked on PG&E during PG&E's presentation, our proposal kind of holistically is that we should be respecting existing contracts. Any new contract, whatever rules are adopted, should apply. The RA framework should maintain bundling of products in any slices. Unbundling local from system would be too difficult to ensure results in a competitive and rational outcomes in a decentralized framework. That would way increase the complexity of RA to make sure that we're still meeting reliability outcomes. And I know that was proposed by, I believe, CISA in one of the earlier workshops. Our proposal is no unbundling of the RA product types. Under a framework that adds additional slices, we believe that unbundling of those slices would raise a need to explore whether we are abandoning a capacity requirement altogether and open up a debate on whether the move should not be all hours when a resource is physically available, or if it should be to specific slices, increasing complexity, and I think reducing reliability. So in our view, all RA products should remain bundled. System plus local RA cannot exceed the generic NQC. If applicable, the effective flexible capacity is bundled as well. If more than one slice is added, then all slices should be bundled. Just reiterating, unbundling slices would increase the granularity of the product that can be traded, which will reduce liquidity within the slices, leading to competition concerns. Unbundling slices is also likely to add the equivalent of a nested energy product within the RA paradigm, which will have impacts to the pricing for specific resources. I gave examples in my factors that we think are really critical, and I gave the examples about, well, what type of resources could replace different types of resources to illustrate how by incorporating this energy profile, it could quickly make it very difficult for the transactability and the health of the RA market. This is my final slide on this section. We are proposing maintain contracting status quo to the greatest extent possible. Definitely, if additional slices are added, we need to enhance the sufficiency test, the validation, ex post validations. So there's really kind of, in my mind, 3 prongs of this. We need enhancements to the planning reserve margin, enhance the system RA requirement for gross peak based on a probabilistically determined LOLE study. And you can touch back to the Gridwell and Vistra presentations of the 12-1 workshop. We also need to ensure uncertainty risks, including limited energy supply conditions during a day with loss of load risks, are included in the LOLE study to set RA need, which addresses the storage charging concerns that we've discussed. If for more information, see Vistra's presentation from the 1217 workshop. Status quo for contracting and showings. We can maintain in any of the framework status quo on these items. Contracts require bundled RA products and bundled slices, RA contract amounts based on single NQC, per showing period. LSCs and suppliers submit CAISO plans with single NQC per showing period. This really can apply regardless of if you set the period to month or season, so I'm keeping it general. LSCs submit CPUC showings same as today with a single NQC per showing period. CPUC performs a sufficiency assessment relative to meeting the updated gross peak RA requirement that we enhanced in the prior bucket. And then the third, another area that requires enhancements is improvements to the sufficiency test. So CPUC in our proposal should add a sufficiency evaluation for additional slices where there is a risk of a loss of load. CPUC should adjust the single NQC for the showing period to the applicable slice based on expected output. Again, please see Vistra and Gridwell's presentation from 12.1 for some suggestions for the approach for the net peak test validation. And with that, I will close out and open for questions and any comments.
And Kathleen, there are a couple questions, but I did want to ask you quickly for the next section, how long do you need for that? Because we're almost.
Oh, that's yeah, thanks, Julia. That's just an appendice. We've presented on kind of transactability and some level setting on how NQC and EFC works and how it's bundled in, I think, October. So I just added it to the end of this slide deck, but I am done. And so I'm happy to open it up for everyone else.
Great, just want to double check. Okay. And I also want to go back to Scott asked a question. Scott, do you want to come online and ask about the CCAs?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, and if there's a representative from the CCAs who wants to respond in chat, that would be fine too. But this is just getting at the same question that I think Matt and Noah and a couple of other participants have pursued, is just that it would be helpful to get a sense of whether there is a problem and the magnitude of the problem that these hedging proposals are trying to address. And that would be the first step, I think, before putting a lot of effort into developing these mechanisms that may have unintended consequences. So I was throwing it out there to representatives of the CCAs because there is less regulatory oversight on the CPUC's part, and they have more independence if they feel that they have already adequate tools at their disposal to adequately hedge their wholesale price risks. And I apologize for the background noise. I'm in a shared office space.
No worries. And Scott, who are you with again, please?
I'm with Independent Energy Producers.
Thank you. Okay. I'll wait to see if hands raised or additional questions in the chat, but thank you for raising that. Sergio, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a quick clarifying comment to something that was shared by Vistra in their presentation. We're not proposing to unbundle RA products at this point. We've noted that it would be quite complex to do unbundling at this point. And because of that, and to enable transactability, what we have put forth is the possibility of having requirement trading or load requirement trading, however you want to name it, among load serving entities. So yeah, just to clarify that as of this point, we're not advocating for either RA products or characteristics or slices to be unbundled. Thanks.
Hey, Sergio, thanks for that clarification. And I didn't mean to put you on the spot. It was my understanding from one of your last presentations, but so I really appreciate you clarifying.
Sure.
And just for those, I think everyone knows, but the clarification of the back and forth was with CISA.
Yeah, Sergio Inez with CISA, sorry.
No worries. Great. Additional hands raised or questions? Okay, well, let's break and come back at 12:30 and have Nancy and Dariush give the presentation and then open up for broader Q&A. All right, I'll see you all at 12:30. Thank you again so much for your flexibility. Appreciate it today. Talk to you soon.